And he said, I hear that you're thinking about running for my Senate seat. And I said, pardon me? You mean for the South Anchorage Senate District? And he said, yeah. And he went off on this rant about how Ben Stevens got it when he was supposed to have it, and he was owed it, and it was his turn, and blah, 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 blah. And I'm listening to him, Andrew, and I have this baby spit up, which I can smell, and I'm exhausted. But the stories that you're hearing from me today, it's not every day these stories happen. These are the stories that make who you are.
Right.
And I'm listening to him, and all of a sudden, I just realized. I stood up, and I said, you know what? I wasn't actually going to run for the Senate seat. I have a brand new baby, but I am going to run, and I am going to kick your ass in every single one of your precincts.
Did you?
I did.
Hello, East Anchorage. This is Alaska State House Representative Andrew Gray and East Anchorage Matters. The goal of this broadcast is to keep the constituents of Anchorage's Campbell Park, University area, Russian Jack, and Unaka Valley neighborhoods aware of the relevant happenings in the halls of government of our great state. Today, we begin with an interview with Lesil McGuire. She is a lifelong Alaskan, former state senator, women's and rural rights advocate, and mother. She lives in Anchorage and works as a consultant in the aerospace, technological innovation, and Arctic policy sectors. For those of you who are listening to the East Anchorage Book Club, please know that during legislative session, which started last week, I published a different podcast, East Anchorage Matters, which has an interview with an Alaskan of interest and importance, but also a legislative update regarding what's happening in Juneau. Make sure you are subscribed to East Anchorage Matters.
Lesil McGuire.
Yes.
Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
I'm so glad you're here. Let's start with your early life.
So I came to Alaska when I was 6 months old. I hate to say that I wasn't born here. My brother was born here at the Alaskan Native Hospital. My dad was in the public health service, and our family was stationed here. We fell in love with it and started our life here. So I grew up in the very district that I ultimately represented. Went to Bayshore Elementary, Mears Junior High, and Diamond High School in the 70s, born in 1971. So lived through that period of time in Alaska, very formative in that in 1985 and 84, the permanent fund dividend was coming into fruition. I can remember my father laying down the 4 permanent fund dividend checks and then putting $100 bills next to them to show us what that check really meant and what it meant to have a non-renewable resource dividend that was coming in. Really interesting time, only followed by 1989 where everything began to crash. My family nearly went bankrupt. A lot of families did. And so the volatility of Alaska was a part of my early years, active in academics and sports at Diamond High. Great education. The last thing I'll say on that, as I come into the building today and I'm hearing the discussion on the base student allocation, what comes up for me, I had the best teachers. I had classroom sizes that allowed for my individual needs to be focused on alongside my peers. I went away to college and law school and sat right beside people who had been at very good preparatory schools. And I had a command of writing. I had a command of math. And that was all because of the commitment that Alaska was making to education at that time. So I feel like I grew up in an interesting, volatile time period, but one that I wouldn't trade places with any Alaskan student right now. And I think that's very sad to say.
Mm-hmm.
If, as we go into the year 2024, why wouldn't it be the case then that our children would have more opportunities than we did?
Mm-hmm. 100%.
That's in my heart today.
Yeah.
Really.
I also was curious about your parents. Tell us a little bit about them.
Beautiful people. They were poor kids because they grew up in families where the needs weren't always there. They taught my brother and I to appreciate everything that we have, to be grateful for the land of opportunity that we live in, and not just to pay lip service to the people around all of us that need a hand up. Also, my parents were extremely educated. Education was really important. Back to the subject of the day.
Your dad was a doctor.
My dad ended up being an orthopedic surgeon, 21 patents right here in Anchorage, Alaska. He was the head of the North American Arthroscopic Knee Academy, all those kinds of things. And my mom owned executive travel agencies, built it up from a small one on international to 4 of them. So they led by example to show us that anything was possible in Alaska if you put your hard work into it and perseverance. We grew up in a family that taught that everyone is equal. And I'm so grateful for that, because I later down the road in life bumped into people who didn't share that value system. And I really think that's an important part of being a lawmaker. If you are in a representative democracy, if you don't believe that everyone is equal, it's going to be really difficult for you to lead, to really think about what those policies are. So I felt very fortunate to grow up in a family. Early on, discrimination wasn't even really something we had to talk about. It was just something that was known to be anathema to who we were.
So your dad was a doctor and your mom was like an entrepreneur.
Yeah.
Oh, why'd you become a lawyer?
Gosh, I feel like my dad is speaking down from the heavens asking that question, because he asked the very same question. He's like, really? I originally did want to be an OBGYN, and I started going down that path. When I got into college, I realized that I was an avid studier of history and philosophy, and I sought out classes on casuistry and Aristotle and Plato. And so I let myself go where my interests were. And at the root of it, even though I didn't think I was going to run for office, my interest in the law was justice, human rights. I wanted to understand how the Constitution was truly applied. I was an early feminist, and I didn't like the way that I saw women being treated. I worked for Ted Stevens in between college and law school, and Ted was an influential part of that. He would not allow Alaskans to be legislative aides unless they had a Juris Doctorate. So you could be an LC, you could do some of the back channel work, but his belief was that if you were going to help write laws, you needed to know how they were interpreted. So I think that was also a big piece of it. But in working on, this was before the 100 years of women's right to vote, I just remember scratching my head thinking, how is that possible that women as an entire gender of our species were excluded from the fundamental right to vote? And then African Americans and indigenous people. Back to my point about equality, I wanted to know how that system worked, and I wanted to understand how to help fight for people's rights, to understand what my rights were. I went down the corporate route first, which is funny to think about, international law and corporate law, and was with a law firm, Birchwort, Bittner and Giroux. And yeah, that was an easy decision. I remember I was making about $160,000 a year. I was 28 years old. And I remember just understanding that the money was not motivating to me, and that what I was doing in pushing paper was not ultimately going to fulfill me. And you put those signals out to the universe, and they were looking for a counsel for the Judiciary Committee, and I applied for it and I got it. And I was here 3 months working downstairs when Sean Purnell, who was leading the Senate, called me to his office, and I thought it was to talk about some issue. Mm-hmm. And he said, I'm retiring and John Cowdery's moving over, and would you consider running for a House seat? And I said, oh my gosh, no, absolutely not. There was no question. I said, nope, I'm good. And then there were a group of people from my district that just kept pushing and pushing. And it was right up against the June 1st deadline. And there was a guy called Ray Metcalf who was running. and would have won by name ID. And I did some research on him, and I didn't like what I uncovered. So I ultimately said, all right, I'll go in for this and I'll hold the seat and I'll see if I can do some good and stay there a couple years and then move on.
So that was the first race.
Yeah.
So listening to you talk about your interest in law and your focus on equality and being an early feminist, if you didn't know, I think she probably ran as a Democrat because that's what's in my head.
Right.
So tell us about being a Republican. I assume Sean Parnell approaching you was because you were a registered Republican. Did he know?
I would assume. It's interesting that our families had a friendship and his parents were long-serving Democrats. And my dad and his dad had been friends through many years.
And your dad was a Republican.
Yes. But
like any good orthopedic surgeon.
Andrew, this is a really interesting thing to describe. And for anyone who's listening, especially young people, but really anybody in their life, just to contemplate how labels, how affiliations come to be. I have friends who grew up in Catholic families who have only recently said, I'm really not Catholic. I really don't want to identify with that anymore. I also have friends who've said, I will always be Catholic. And they'll say, please don't press me for more of those details. It is a family identification point, to which I say, okay. So how do those things come about? My father is the only Republican out of the 6 children. All of my aunts and uncles are Democrats.
Wow.
All of my cousins are, all my family, Democrats. But my father forms the Citizens Coalition for Tort Reform. And he went to battle with the trial lawyers. Big time. He was the youngest head of the Alaskan Medical Association.
What was your dad's first name?
David.
David McGuire.
And he and Ray Brown, who is now a dear friend and ultimately constituent of mine and supporter, they would go to philosophical battle. Back to my point, civilly.
Mm-hmm.
They would go around the state and do these civil debates, shake hands, give a hug afterwards, and walk off, okay? There was a point they both had about some degree of frivolous litigation, some degree of increased insurance costs, Alaskan doctors and others going bare, and then over here, the innocent victim who truly is harmed, and to what degree you can make them whole again. So I, 7th grade, started going out, getting signatures on this initiative, one of the first citizens initiatives. So that was a call. I didn't think of it as Republican or Democrat at all. Now you flash forward, and we had some of these amazing women in my district who happened to be Republican women. Drew Pierce, Alice Hanley, Virginia Collins. So I started volunteering on their campaigns. And I would go hang door knockers. I would go put signs up. 8th grade, 9th grade. I knew that my parents were Republicans. What they told me why they were Republicans, they would say Lincoln Republicans. They would say, we came to Alaska to have liberty. We came here for opportunity. We don't want to live the way that other people live in the lower 48. We want to have freedom. We want to have limited government control. We want to have maximum opportunity. Okay. But again, no discrimination. My parents, very early on, gay marriage, people are all equal. No discrimination against people with mental or physical disabilities. No discrimination based on gender. I was the oldest daughter to my dad, who was like, yeah, you're going to fly this airplane. You're going to catch this fish. You're going to do everything. And so I thought that is what a Republican was, because that's the family that I grew up in, much like I would assume someone who is Catholic or someone who is Jewish or someone who is in some sort of affiliated group. Whatever their family version of that is, they believe up until a certain point that's the way it is. Now, as life moved on and it came time for me to participate in the political process, and the question was, what are you going to run as? Of course, at 18, I registered as a Republican because that's what my parents were.
Mm-hmm. And you worked on those campaigns and you had this very broad idea of what a Republican was. Why wouldn't you be?
The Republicans that I knew were great people. They were more fiscally conservative. And a lot of times you do see people who earn more, who don't want to share as much. But coming into it, if I were to say that there were any kind of a driving force behind it, it would be a fiscal force, but mostly a freedom force. Now I get elected, and
it was 2000.
In the year 2000, and fortunately, I'm in Bayshore, Jewel Lake, Campbell Lake, very educated district. 63% of the people in my district are unaffiliated, nonpartisan independents. But the district tended to lean more Republican, okay? So I'm going out, I'm having conversations with my neighbors. They range. One of my first initiatives was to bring Peace Corps volunteers back into qualification for the permanent fund dividend. It took me 6 years. And over Lyda Green's dead body, because she wanted to tell me about these liberal, greeny people. Why am I defending them? And I said, what do you mean, why am I defending them? Thank goodness they're doing the work they're doing. So, in other words, Andrew, right away, I started to realize that who I was as a person did align with who my dad and mom were, and who some of the other early representatives who bore the Republican name. But my very first vote, and I share this very openly with people, was on an amendment, controversial vote. There was an amendment to a larger bill to allow for gay people who chose to be in a committed long-term relationship with one another to share health benefits. And the arguments that were made on the floor made absolute sense to me. There were no arguments made on the floor that made any other sense to me. So I pushed yes. And being a freshman, I had no idea. The speaker gavelled down and called to the finance co-chairman and literally...
Because this was a liberal bill and you had voted yes.
It was an amendment made by the Democratic caucus.
Okay, gotcha.
And I had voted yes on it.
So the Democrats had put this amendment forward. It doesn't matter what it is, you vote no.
Correct. In their opinion. So they hauled me back into the speaker chambers. And I was terrified. I'll be straight up about that.
Who was speaker then?
Brian Porter.
And Beth Cortula loved.
Yes. There are many great things about Brian Porter. Also a longtime family friend of ours. We'd all grown up together. I loved his humility regarding his DUI and how he took on his alcoholism, how he took on substance abuse treatment in the state. He had a fair-minded approach. Brian was very good. I echo Beth's comments on that. However, he was a taskmaster. He was a former police chief. And Eldon Mulder was even more of a taskmaster. And remember, I told you there were 27 of us in this caucus.
It was a big majority.
It was. And so this was a moment, obviously, to make an example.
Eldon Mulder was the majority leader?
Co-chair of
finance.
And so the conversation in the caucus room was, what in the heck was that? To which I said, I voted for something that I believe my constituents believe in and I believe in. And to which I was told, absolutely not. Well, you cannot vote.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
If there was 27 in your majority, does it mean that 26 voted no?
That's my point. I said the amendment didn't pass anyway.
Yeah, who cares?
Why are we having this conversation? And so what it was for me is to learn a variety of things.
They were like, you vote with your caucus, no matter what.
If you peel, then other people might peel.
Right.
And you didn't get permission to peel. And oh, by the way, and so on and so forth. Very important early lesson about process and how important it is to understand inside the space of your majority caucus how you're going to move things and what hill you're going to die on. However, it was the moment where I really understood. I said, I can't in good conscience vote against that. I have no idea why I would. And I said, as I told you very famously, if you're going to ask me to vote against love, you have the wrong person. I will not sell my soul for any procedure, for any rule, for anything. That is about love. That is about families coming together to make healthcare decisions to support their families. I am an absolute yes every single time to include them, and I don't know why we haven't. And remember, I'd come from Oregon for law school and undergrad. So there's also another thing that was happening to me, which is the realization of just how far behind Alaska was in humanity.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was at that moment that I said, I don't know if this is going to work out, me being a Republican.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think their
Like in your first term, you were already having that question.
Seriously. And so I said, okay, I think they think being a Republican is something different.
I want to ask a question, like bouncing back a little bit. So you had this very broad idea of what a Republican was. Did you have an idea of what a Democrat was?
Yes. So what's interesting about that is that at that time, I would say, I also think in Alaska's history, Democrats and my mom went on to be life partners with Bill Sheffield for 33 years. So that's also really interesting.
Because I heard you speak at his funeral.
So it wasn't that I thought Democrats were bad. That was the sum of my family. More of my family members were.
More Democrats.
Yes. And probably more of our family friends were, and more of the people that I was growing up with. I really honestly think that it comes down to the fact of my parents' influence that parenting has on us, which is with our sons. We want you to be awesome, happy human beings. And so my son is a flaming progressive. I'll just tell you that. I don't want to talk about Democrat or Republican because, quite frankly, no different to spirituality and religion, why is civic mindedness so encapsulated in a label that even a me can't even understand what it is when they say they're that? Hence, my work behind Ballot Measure 2 and other things that I did in my life. Finishing up my first reelection, and frankly, most subsequent elections, my real opponents were the Republican Party. And they went after me with everything they had.
All the way through 2012 with Jeff Landfield.
Correct.
Yeah.
They went after me with everything they had. And so looking back on it, what would be a more suitable? I wished I could have been Lesil McGuire -AK.
Can you talk about your first experience in caucus? It was about public defenders.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we're having a caucus, the same group of amazing human beings, by the way.
2000, first year.
And to mention the fact that we had a self-selecting group of extraordinary Alaskans who were united by their hearts and their faith and belief in humanity and what could happen in the state. We formed the Fiscal Policy Caucus. Yes, we were talking about fiscal policy decisions, but mainly Beth Gertulo, Lisa Murkowski, Andrew Halcrow, Eric Croft.
So Republicans, Democrats, and it's reminiscent of the freshman caucus that we have today.
Correct. What you are in and why I think it is so important. We have not had the size of grouping of just such extraordinary people to come in one wave in such a long time that we have with your caucus, Andrew. And it's such an opportunity. But I thankfully had that caucus, which was my mainstay. That was where we would have dinner together. We would talk over what is the real value of a seasonal sales tax versus the state income tax. What would be the value of using the permanent fund dividend and kind of thinking of it this way? Safe conversations. And why I prefer bipartisan majorities, why I prefer bipartisan groups of leading is because, again, back to the point of the labels, regardless even if the labels are true, they create their own weather. And what happens is, left unchecked, the people get left out because you have party leaders or political operatives or lobbyists or special interests who use the opportunity to divide the groups. And without the group being together, breaking bread, looking each other in the eye, having social compact, you don't end up with the best policy because you need both sides to come in and do this. So in unfettered large majorities of either party, I have seen untenable results. And this, in my opinion, was one. So you had a fractionalized, very far right group, which had already been ostracized over the subsistence issue. So the caucus was limping along, and there were many of us that were saying, I don't really want to be a part of this.
We hear reference to that nowadays. And for those of us who were paying attention then, what was the far right's position on subsistence issues?
The far right position on subsistence issues fundamentally was, in my opinion, racist. And I get to speak freely now. There are some policies that you can look at and say, that is the result of sexism. That is the result of racism. You can put labels and reasons for why it came about, but at the root of it, in my opinion, our Constitution is very clear regarding subsistence rights. And our first peoples who settled in this land thousands of years before us and who live off the land still today are entitled to subsistence takings. And got to tell you, I didn't know anybody that had an issue with that. White people can go out and fly in the airplanes and hunt and fish all they want. And do they have a right to enjoy Alaska? Absolutely. Nobody's talking about that. Okay? There are plenty of opportunities for them to hunt and fish. But the two things are not the same. And so what happened is you had a group of white men in the early legislature that decided to just peel off and say, we're going to take our ball and go home. If you don't agree that we will change subsistence to mean all people of all races, urban and rural, we're out of here. And I just remember thinking, I don't think I'm in the right place. Okay. So that had already happened. Now we're in a
They wanted the same rights to subsistence that Alaska Native people
Absolutely
had.
correct.
Like, and that if you discriminated against them is how they would frame it.
That is exactly how they phrased it. And I recall hearing, there was a period of time, Andrew, where even coming out of law school, and I had studied indigenous law also as a forte, and the canons of Indian law and the superintendents and all of the things that we've agreed to through treaties and everything else. You couldn't even bring up the word tribe
or without setting them off.
Oh, it was like regardless of the actual legal fact and principle of that organizing construct. So that had already happened. But in this caucus that we're talking about, we're laying out what would be the budget. Oil had been very low. Again, why we rely on the single resource, big question. That being said, and so we needed some budget cuts. And so hand goes up. And the idea is to eliminate the public defender agency. And
this is in a
private caucus.
In the speaker's chambers.
Correct. Private caucus.
Somebody raised their hand. One way, we can just cut the public
defender agency.
No one needs a lawyer who's accused of a crime. They're criminals or something like that.
So I said, did I hear that right? And so up comes the argument, which says, look, they're guilty anyway. Why do we have this line item? And we blah, blah, blah. But what was terrifying to me is that one by one more hands started going up.
All in support of getting rid of it.
All in support of eliminating the public defender agency. And this is that moment as a leader when you are new to a body.
You're like a young woman, new to the body.
28, 29, we're young. Trying to fit in, wanting to find my way, not wanting to bust through the doors and break all the china. And so you're trying to get your head, and also open-minded and want to be a listener and want to learn from other people. So again, I'm listening to the arguments and I understand the bias in the arguments. I do. But then there just came that point where I raised my hand and I said, with all respect, it is a constitutional obligation to defend the accused. And I'm just wanting to be sure that we all understand that when the government accuses you of a crime, that does not necessarily mean that you are guilty. And in fact, the presumption is of innocence. And why that presumption is so important is actually going all the way back to our forefathers and mothers and the whole point of America in the distinguishment of who we are in democracy. And the public defender agency is there then to give that equal right to someone who does not have the resource base to come up against the government and make a fair case. And then how do we know? And so for years in my Judiciary Committee, I brought the Innocence Project in. Once a year, I had them come in and bring a story because what I wanted to do was continue teaching people the real stories about how poor people,
And how mistakes are made.
how mistakes are made. They are made.
Vic Fischer, I interviewed him for the podcast. We talked about him co-sponsoring the legislation to get rid of the death penalty during the territorial legislature. I believe it was 2 out of 10 of the people that we had put to death were white.
Wow.
8 were people of color. But what he said, but all of them were indigent.
Exactly.
All of them
That does
were
not
poor.
surprise me.
We never put to death a wealthy person.
It does not surprise me.
And so that's why we got rid of the death penalty.
That's right.
We knew that there was something wrong.
Yes, that is a beautiful point from Vic. I love Vic. I've benefited from him being a mentor to me through the years, he and Jane. And that's absolutely right. And it's back to that point, which is that, again, I think the partisan system is bordering on archaic. And that is the reason that I came back out of political retirement, if you will, to help champion ballot measure 2. Because I tried many times during my legislative service to come at that in different ways. And I couldn't succeed given the influence that parties have on the representatives that are here. But what I really believe is that I'm not here to pick on the Republicans and I'm not here to pick on the Democrats. I think that when you align yourself with a party over your people, it again is like spirituality to religion. You have to be very careful. Because what if there's an edict that comes down that says let's just call it this religion. And in order to be spiritual, you're that religion. And if you don't follow this tenet, then, and without naming names, I think we can think about religions that have evolving practices of adopting different tenets. And so let's just cut away from that and ask ourselves, are we mature enough? And do we value our future enough to have an open, honest dialogue between those that seek to represent you and those who seek to be represented without all of the stuff?
Mm-hmm.
We can talk about it. We can talk about it.
And I know that I am not the only candidate who's ever had this experience at the door, where you have a great conversation with someone at the door about a real issue in the community. And this is exactly what she said to me. I assume you're a Republican.
Right.
And I said, actually, I'm not. And she backed up a little bit and she was like, an independent? And I was like, I'm a Democrat. And she was like, I will not vote for you. And she shut the door.
Yeah, that's right. It works that way. And then all of that conversation, which was very productive and authentic.
Yes.
You were having the kind of conversation that a representative should be having with their people.
Mm-hmm. I'm a Democrat.
Yeah.
For reasons I registered when I was 18.
Yes.
And I've kept it.
Yeah.
But it's simply been said to me that in my district, no matter what I do or who I am, most of the folks in my district aren't going to know who I am and they're going to vote for the D.
Yeah, that's
and they're like, and if you were to lose that D, you would lose this race. Yeah. Not because of anything you said or did.
Yeah.
It's simply because that's just how that district works.
Well, and quite frankly, that was the district that I was in and still really is. And again, I don't blame Alaskans and I don't blame us for wanting to serve and for being willing to participate in the process as it exists. I just will leave it with this. My hope is that if this podcast goes in a time capsule, 20 years from now, a civic-minded Alaskan pulls it out and says, what did they used to do?
100%.
That is.
You know what we didn't finish? What happened when you raised your hand and explained the constitutional reasons why we need public defenders?
Actually, I ultimately won the argument, which is a really good point. There's a time to be conciliatory and to cooperate. And then there's a time to fight. And knowing civilly, with kindness, and not ad hominem attacks, not degrading someone as a human being and the 15,000 Alaskans standing behind them, but really to be firm and to say, this is not a cut that is supported by the Constitution. And also, as Republicans, it should not be supported philosophically. Because if the Republican Party is a party about smaller government and individual liberty, then the last thing that you want is for any government to know that it has unlimited power to prosecute people in its community, regardless of proof, and then knowing that certain individuals in your community won't have the means to then defend themselves. And the other point that I made, and ultimately I did win the argument, it was a fierce battle back and forth, and I think it took at least another caucus to get through it. But remember that for every right that is taken away from somebody else, if you can't think about it because you care about their rights, which I would really hope you could, at least consider this. Any erosion of human rights erodes yours. And if the process begins to fail because you don't like poor people and you don't like brown people, or you think their wrongs should be punished by death or otherwise, and they don't deserve to be defended, just recognize that at some point, the system will come for you. So if you can't get your head around the idea that as Alaskans, we stand for the rights of all of us, and we should, then at least get your head around that point.
I also know that you decided you wanted to be in leadership that day.
Yes, I did.
Yeah.
Sorry. So I did. So I said, okay, I'm going to go in. And my dear friend Lisa had been in the consternation around subsistence.
And she was the chair of judiciary? No, she wanted to be chair of judiciary.
She did. She wanted to be. And so that had been the last verdict, if you will.
Mm-hmm. Because she was on the side of the Alaskan Natives having their subsistence rights.
That's right. And there were some issues around reproductive rights that people in my gender really need to have over their bodies to make choices about their life. And that was the day that I said, all right, I've had enough of this crap. I'm not going to sit here and deal with lengthy, flawed interpretations of the Constitution as one of the very few Juris Doctorates in this caucus. And at that moment, it was all white men. I was one of 4 women.
Out of 27.
Yeah. And I recognized immediately that I was in the minority from that perspective. But it wasn't just by numbers. It was like this way of being. It was this casual disregard so easily of something such as your constitutional right to be defended against your own government. And so I just said, yeah, I'm definitely going to fucking be judiciary chair. And I did. And I won it. And I went on a campaign. And then the other part I said to you is I decided I'm going to go around and meet with people and find where we have common ground, where they like a view that I have, where they would feel, right?
Do you remember an example of a difficult person that you were able to find common ground with?
Yeah, John Coghill.
What was your common ground?
For years and years, we were able to continue to come back and find our common ground. In fact, I just did an op-ed on New Energy Alaska campaign that I'm heading up with a group of people to inspire Alaskans to refocus our commitment to renewable energy sources and projects around that. And when I reached John and Charisse and Bill Wilikowski, they all said yes. And I really...
Charisse Millette.
Yes. And I feel proud of that. And I hope that when you leave service one day, you will be able to do a similar thing. That is a litmus test. If you can live your life in this building, being true to your community, being true to your values, and still maintaining respect and friendship with people on all of the spectrums, you will have done a good job. Mm-hmm. And so how did I reach John? Ultimately, we agreed that on the issue of subsistence, we did not agree. We agreed that on the issue of abortion, we did not agree. But what was interesting is that we found that we had some common, I guess you'd call almost libertarian things that were in us. Some things in us, there was some eminent domain stuff going on that he was concerned about in North Pole that I could get behind, where I said, see, that's just like the other thing that I'm talking about. And my example that I gave to him on abortion that he actually respected is I said, look, I studied in China when I was in law school. I was at the Chinese Institute of Politics and Law in Shanghai. And any more than I don't want a government telling women they cannot make a decision regarding the reproductive elements of their body, do I want to be in the flip of that in an autocratic government that says you have to have an abortion? And I said, look, it is a principle for me. And it's back to my point about the public defender agency. And I guess it's probably the reason that I ended up a Republican, if you really look at it. That was the strain that I pulled on. And ultimately, he and I found that common ground and were able to work for years together. We served in my final years of office in leadership together in the Senate. And we would vigorously debate things with respect. When I was rules chair and he was majority leader, there was a tribal languages bill that I put on the floor. And I had some members of leadership that did not feel that was appropriate. They did not want that.
Again, because it wasn't a traditional Republican bill.
Correct. And they made up my opinion. Again, my opinion is that people have these racism, sexism components, and they need to start getting really honest about it in terms of what they're supporting, what they're not supporting. Because
they'll rationalize it in some way.
They do.
They'll say it's not about race
It was 53 languages in our state that existed before English that wanted to be recognized, that all of these tribal organizations had been working with all of us for many years on. There was not a fiscal note associated with it. They didn't say every ballot must be printed and all these things. It wasn't anything like that. It was a recognition of that. And absolutely, it deserved to pass into law. That's an example of one of those where we had a vigorous debate and we ultimately came to terms on it. So why is that important? We're living in this age of Donald Trump. And this started happening right at the tail end. In my lifetime, I watched things get progressively more partisan, progressively more hateful, and I think dangerously so. And so my hope for Alaska is that because of our small polis and because of our commitment to our values and our freedoms, and as I always say to people who come from us, Alaskans are so nice. You guys are just so nice. Everyone's so nice. And I say, yes, and there's a good reason for that, because if you're an asshole and your car breaks down, you'll freeze to death on the road. Mm-hmm. So taking that metaphor and moving it out, we need to remember that Donald Trump or no Donald Trump or anyone else that's from outside this state, the way that we interact with one another has to be with civility and humanity. And we can have vigorous debates, and that doesn't make any one of us bad people so long as we're ethical and committed to the process in the marketplace of ideas, right?
You've also said always approach difficult people with warmth.
Yes, always. Yeah, that is a tenement, lead with love. And that doesn't just mean your definition of love. It means that love is unconditional. And to be part of life, to be part of this world and humanity means to be part of love. And we owe it to each other to love one another. And that means to listen, to attempt to understand, to attempt to align, to attempt to compromise where we can. And where we can't, again, to approach with warmth, but firm warmth that says, Andrew, how's your son? How are you as a person? And not just to get a vote, not just to get but because I want you to know that I respect your life and the fact that we work in this building. At that moment, it's going to be more likely that we can open up and be vulnerable to one another. And in the example that I used of John Coghill, who is a tremendous human being, one of the most principled men I've ever met in my life.
A true statesman.
A true statesman. And he would say the same of me. So does the fact that we both can agree that life is absolutely valuable, we both can agree that we do not want abortions, we both can agree that women have value, we cannot agree about how the government should have a role in that. We disagree on that. That does not mean that I don't approach John with warmth and genuine affection for his life and his family. And what can that do? There are some things that can be done, that are done, where you can work out some compromises, where you can give a little bit here, they can give a little bit here. And then there's always another day. And so if the next day you've blown each other up over the single issue that is a product of a value system that you've come up through the years of life about, and neither of you are hateful about, but you've already blown up the ship and the bridge, then what about those students that are just trying to get educated, or the people who are just trying to get ambulatory care in a rural community? They're screwed because the two of you have allowed your egos to supersede your role as a servant leader, to sit down and listen and understand that it's a humbling process.
100%. When you don't know what you're doing and you're very aware that you don't know what you're doing, it's hard to have a big ego. It's like, I don't know what's happening. I don't know where I'm supposed to be right now. Staff.
Where's the bathroom?
What do I say today? Like literally, that was last
Clapping
year.
on the floor.
I was like,
Yes.
write something for me.
Yes.
They'd say, can you make this motion? I was like, what do I say? I need you to tell me the
Yes.
exact words.
And do not miss a single word.
Exactly.
Yes.
But as time goes by,
Correct.
I can see it. I have an insight
Yes.
that there's ego coming in.
Yes.
I'll be like, why didn't I get a note about that?
Yes.
Like, I
Yes.
just gave an amazing speech. Where are my notes?
Yes.
On the floor.
There you go.
What? I was like, that was a dud, wasn't it? I didn't get the banging I was expecting. Like,
Yes.
I hate myself
I
for that.
love this though.
But I
This
hate
is-
that I have those thoughts.
But I love this conversation because this is also what it's about to serve. If we want the public to have a better understanding of our institution that is their institution and a better view of us, we have to be more vulnerable. We have to be willing to explain that we're doing our best too. And also we're human beings. And power is one of the most addictive and powerful drugs.
Mhm.
And that's what I always try to say to young lawmakers, to new lawmakers is, oh, it's not in the first 2 years. It's not even the second 2 years. Where you got to keep a watch on it is once you get it all down.
And I want to know, the move to the Senate, what instigated that? How did that come about? And what was the difference between serving in the two bodies?
Okay, I'll start with the easier one. The difference in serving between the two bodies is significant. They are two different family units with two different origin stories, two different ways of being in history. The Senate is interestingly more egalitarian, in my opinion. I found as a woman, moving from the House to the Senate, I was much more respected. I was just included and treated as an equal, 100%. So that was an interesting thing that surprised me. Smaller body, easier to maneuver. Because of the length of the term, people calm down a little more. And so I feel like when I was in the House and my empathy for you, there is a sense of panic
All the time.
that's always around, and it can't help but influence moods. And it can't help but influence drafting of bills and those kinds of things. How did I come over? That's an interesting story. I will end on that story for you. I had just given birth to Grace and David, March 2nd of 2006. I had been in the House for 6 years. I had said to myself that I would do 3 terms. I said, if I get asked to go to the Senate, I'd do 3 terms there, but I don't really want to do a whole bunch more because this was the days of Ramona Barnes and John Cowdery, people who were really making poor ethical decisions and things because they'd stayed too long. And they like thought
I've
their
heard
campaign
stories
checkbook
about
was-
Ramona Barnes that I just can't even believe could be true.
I'm
About
just telling you.
grabbing people, squeezing.
Seriously.
Yeah.
Seriously. And she had this fishbowl where people were required to put checks in. People were using their campaign checkbooks like personal. It was unbelievable. Okay. And by the way, I just knew that was wrong. I didn't need anybody to tell me. Like, I was like, what? Okay. And my whole freshman class, we're like, whoa. So I just attributed that to, you've just been around here too long. I mean, you overstayed your welcome. Okay. So part of it was that, but really what happened, I was breastfeeding Grayson and judiciary. Anyway, it was up and down, and I had baby spit on my suit. And I came up for a floor vote, and it was at the end, sine die, end of that session, late at night. I am exhausted, new mama. And Norm Rokeberg, who was the House member for the other part of the district, and we were both in leadership together. I made judiciary leadership position ultimately. He was rules. I wanted to stay in judiciary. I'd never let that go.
So you were judiciary chair.
I'd never let that go after that first
Right.
instance. Never. I just always kept that with me. But we made it a leadership. So we were both in leadership, and he said, hey, I want to talk to you in my office. And we had just had a leadership meeting. So I said, okay, well, think beyond what because I was tired and cranky at the end of my thing. And he said, no, I just need to talk to you in my office. And I said, oh, interesting. Okay. So I followed behind him to his office, which was right there off the chambers. And I came in, and he pulled up a seat behind his
rules chair.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He pulled up a seat behind his desk. Pulled up a seat. And had me sit. Like, you don't do that with colleagues.
Yeah.
Never do that with colleagues. You get my point. Never do
Yeah.
that. And don't do it with a constituent either. Point is, and he said, I hear that you're thinking about running for my Senate seat. And I said, pardon me? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I hear you're thinking about running for my Senate seat. And I said, you mean for the South Anchorage Senate District? And he's like, yeah. And he went off on this rant about how Ben Stevens got it when he was supposed to have it, and he was owed it, and it was his turn, and blah, bitty, blah, bitty, blah, bitty, blah. And I'm listening to him, Andrew, and I have this baby spit up, which I can smell, and I'm exhausted. And what's happening again, it goes, the stories that you're hearing from me today, it's not every day these stories happen. These are the stories that make who you are.
Right.
And where you understand exactly who you are for your people, for what you're doing. And I'm listening to him, and all of a sudden, I just realized. And I stood up and I said, you know what? I wasn't actually going to run for the Senate seat. I'm exhausted. I have a brand new baby. But you know what? I am going to run, and I am going to kick your ass in every single one of your precincts.
Did you?
I did. I said, so just sit back. Why would you say that? Why would you say that? And I said, because you know what? My people, our neighborhood doesn't need a leader like you that thinks you're entitled to a seat. We've had enough of that. We've had enough of that.
That's
And
awesome.
I did. And I campaigned with Grayson and a baby Bjorn, literally door knocking. And I started with his half of the district first because it was new to me. And I would go through every single precinct, every single house over and obsessively. And so on election night, and obviously we're always scared on
Right.
election night. Come on. We're always terrified. We have all these weird superstitious rituals.
Right.
I always go to Las Margaritas. I always sit at the same table. I always have my sit. We're terrified inside. The public undressing that would be, and why people who
lose.
run are so brave. And as the returns are coming in, thankfully, the universe delivers his precincts first.
And you knew it was over. Why did you leave elected office, and just catch us up on what you're working on today?
Yeah. So in 2014, I started quietly announcing to people Grayson was going to be 10 I had never had a day of my life as a mom to him without being in public office. He was born into public office. I was sitting on my judiciary seat 2 weeks after having an episiotomy, after a phone call that was like, you're in leadership, we need you.
Oh my God.
I can't describe that call to you, Andrew. Really, and my mom said, well, you just tell him you can't. And I remember, and this is the unique thing about the legislature, that people should really understand how hard people work for you. You can say there are no rules, they do this, they do that. But actually what you need to understand is they're interpreted for you and against the members because there are no rules. There's no maternity leave. There are no OSHA rights. There's no anything. And yeah, it was 2 weeks after, and the phone call was from my friend John Coggill. And he said, Lesil, we need you back. You're in leadership. We've got to go. And I said, okay, I get it. So Alaska Airlines to this day, when they see Grayson, they're like, we've never had such a tiny baby.
Oh my God. So
on the plane.
2 week.
Literally,
Yeah.
2-week-old baby. Did not know what I was going to do. Reneva Moss, his chief of staff, John's chief of staff, daughter, fortunately, was on this hiatus from school. I said, could you come? Can I pay you to help me? She'd come into my office. She'd help me with the baby. Then I'd go back and chair my committee. Then I'd come back and breastfeed. I'd come back. This is literally the reality of what was going on. So Grayson never had that. I saw the years slipping away. My father became terminally ill. And honestly, the Trump situation, I looked around and I said, it's time to give somebody else an opportunity to lead. I don't want to become those people.
You don't want to become Ramona Barnes.
I don't want to become Ramona Barnes, and I don't know how you become it, but I'm scared of, who knows? I don't want to become entitled. I want new ideas. I want fresh energy. We don't own these seats. I want my son to have a chance at having his mom focused on him. And so once I made that decision and made peace with it, it's interesting how everything just folds in like that. So that was really it. It was a feeling that my dad often said, leave before being left and leave them wanting more. And I love those two rules.
Oh, yeah.
And I think they're really important. And Grayson has so appreciated it. I filed a letter of intent for lieutenant governor and considered that. I spent a year with an exploratory committee, raised money, and God, did I enjoy that. I have to tell you, even though I ultimately decided not to file, I loved traveling the state.
Oh, yeah.
And Grayson went with me. We went to the far north. We went all over. It was so beautiful and also hard to listen to the stories. And so ultimately I made that. But also, I want to say one other thing on that point. It wasn't my first time to those places. And something else I want to remind your caucus is how important it is to travel to each other's districts. So Neil Foster, when I saw him today, he's like, I will never forget when you came to visit me for Iditarod. And then Reggie Jewell, who was in my fiscal policy caucus, my very first trip, I said, I'm going to come visit you. And he's, what? And I said, yep, you just tell me when. He taught me how to blanket toss. And he's like, Lesil, this is the only women's shelter we have. I'm like, this is unacceptable. I mean, it changed. So really try to remember how important that is.
Lesil McGuire, thank you so much for being on the show today. I just have to say, I wish you were in this building with us because I wish that we had someone like you who's really invested in helping us be better.
Yes.
And there are great people here. They're doing the very best they can.
Yeah. Yeah.
I wish that we had
Me too.
more.
I know. We do. And I'm going to be around. And it's
Thank
why
you
I
so
take a
much.
minute. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now for the legislative update for Monday, January 22nd, 2024. The House and Senate met in joint session last Thursday evening for the purposes of overriding Governor Dunleavy's veto of increased education funding. I received questions from some of you about why none of us debated the issue that evening, why none of us talked on the floor. Hindsight is 2020. In retrospect, I wish that I could have given my planned remarks about how our children today's school experience is less than what it was in the past because our legislature, our governor have failed to fund education appropriately. We have not kept up with inflation. In effect, every year has been a big cut to their funding, and the result has been that our school districts have made do with less and less, and it is finally caught up. Cuts of entire programs are on the table if we don't do something. If we had successfully overridden the education funding veto, we would have provided about $88 million immediately to our school districts. A 3/4 majority was required to override that veto. We got 34 yes votes out of 60. We missed the threshold by a lot. However, there is still hope. House Bill 140, which was initially a bill to improve internet connectivity in rural schools, but has since become so much more. It now includes a provision to increase the base student allocation. That first increase, as it was initially amended to the bill, was by $680 per student. Now it's at a much more modest $300 per student. We know that a $1,413 increase per student is what it would take to truly make our districts whole. Thank you for all of you who called into the Rules Committee special Saturday meeting and testified in favor of the higher amount to the BSA. We are still working very hard to adequately, permanently increase the funding for education in our state. I will conclude today's episode with my first special order. I memorialized the great former state senator Vic Fischer on Tuesday, the first day of session. When we give speeches on the floor, we get nervous and sometimes we forget things. I forgot my big climactic line, so I will say it here. Vic didn't just like to talk about his values, he lived his values. He did what was right, no matter what.
Madam Speaker, on October 22nd, Alaska lost a true hero, Victor Fischer. I didn't get to know him personally until the last 2 years of his life. I interviewed him for my podcast, and in preparation for the interview, I sent a long list of very complicated questions. And his wife, Jane Anvik, replied with, very politely, he's 97 years old. He likes to talk about his values. And if you listen to the interviews, you will hear that he did like to talk about his values, but he also expertly answered every single one of those complicated questions. We were so lucky to have all of Vic for as long as we did. He was born of a Russian mother and an American father in Berlin. He and his family fled Hitler's Germany in the 1930s by way of Czechoslovakia. And his mother and he were doing a tour of Prague, and they were about to go into a Jewish cemetery. And the Nazi soldier guarding the gate screamed at Vic, "Bist du Jüdisch? Are you Jewish?" And Vic had never heard the word Jewish before. He didn't know what that was. And he said no. And he toured the cemetery. Afterwards, his mother said to him, "Hey, I got to let you know something. We actually are Jewish." They made it to Moscow, where, thanks to Vic's father's connections, his connections at the Kremlin, they attended May Day celebrations on Red Square, where he stood just feet from Joseph Stalin himself. At Vic's junior high school in Moscow, so many of his teachers were executed by the state that they had to shut down the school. Vic's very best friend, his father was murdered by the state, and the night of his murder, he slept on the floor next to Vic's bed. Vic was shown by his mother where their important documents were held, where their passports were hidden, in the very likely case that she could leave the apartment and never return. In spite of these atrocities that he lived through, he was a joyful man who loved to tell funny stories. And one of the funniest was when the family was living back in Germany, he and his brother George were not allowed to learn English. English was the secret language of the parents. And he remembered his parents having an angry, loud argument. And he and his brother begged, "Please don't scream, please don't fight." And his parents said, "Scream, fight. This is just the way English is spoken." Interestingly, although Russian was literally Vic's mother's tongue, and he spoke Russian like a real Russian, he would say, the German language was always the language that was most special to him, his first language. The last time I saw Vic was a couple of months before he passed away. The representative from District 19 and I went to visit Vic and Jane, and we discussed Vic's 1986 re-election campaign for the other body. It was a very contentious election. It was very close. Political consultants came to him and said, Vic, we know your Republican opponent is gay. If we publicize this, he will lose. Vic said, I'm not going to do that. And they said, Vic, listen to us. We have to do this. It was 1986. HIV/AIDS was massacring a generation of gay men. We were feared. We were hated. It would have worked, but Vic stood strong. He knew what it meant to achieve power and maintain power by capitalizing on a population's hatred. He lost re-election by 17 votes. He never served in elected office again. I often say that I stand on the shoulders of the LGBTQ legislators who came before me, and I know Vic's opponent, and he did what he had to do. But I ask you this, do I stand on the shoulders of Vic's opponent, who served that one session in the other body and left Alaska forever? Or do I stand on the shoulders of Vic Fischer, who lost the election, but stayed here, continuing to fight for the underdog, for the disenfranchised, for the poor, for the least among us? I stand on the shoulders of Vic Fischer. Alaska stands on the shoulders of Vic Fischer. Спасибо большое, Vic. Мы тебя любим. До свидания. Vielen Dank, Vic. Wir lieben dich. Auf Wiedersehen. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you, listeners. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, rate, and review East Anchorage Matters. To reach me, email rep.andrew.gray@akleg.gov, and our office number is 907-465-4940.